Well, I draw the line. I don't draw the line. I guess that doesn't sound right. But I guess I used to say, I like to have fun in church. And I hear that all the time. Do you want to have fun in church? I'm not sure that fun is the right word. I want church to be enjoyable. Can we appreciate that there's a difference between those two statements? You can enjoy something that's not fun, but I don't know. Seems like fun is just too whimsical. Am I splitting hairs that need not be split? I don't know, possibly. Anyway, I hope you enjoy coming to church, even though you had to get over that little bit of surprise this morning. I haven't been watching the weather lately, so when I got up this morning and I was stumbling literally to the coffee pot and trying to get that whole process started, I looked out the window and was just shocked to the point of horrified to see a couple inches of snow on the ground in April. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't watch the weather, didn't know it was coming. And yet there it was. And so, hopefully we've gotten over that. It's melting rapidly. Our plow guy called us this morning. He goes, "What do you think? You want me to come out?" I'm thinking, no. We'll drive on it. We'll let it melt. It's April. It can't hang around that long, right? We'll just save the money. We'll save your time. You go back to bed. I'm, sit here, and we'll just let Lord take care of the snow. So that's kind of our current plan. It's not that, he was remiss in his obligation to plow. It's just we're like, no, we're not going to spend the money. It's only a couple inches. We're in New England. This shouldn't be that big a deal, even though it is April and we're in shock. Anyway, James chapter 1 this morning. James chapter 1, as we continue in the series, Don't Panic. And that may seem like kind of a bit of an odd moniker to give this series as a title. But let's think about it for a second. No matter what we commit to doing, and we're in April now, and our annual goals and our New Year's resolutions are long in the rearview mirror, and probably many of them long forgotten. But it seems that no matter what we commit to doing, there is something that is continually working against us in that. No matter what it is we commit. And it could be as silly as New Year's resolution, as serious as an annual goal. It could be a visit to your doctor who says you need to change something about your lifestyle because if not, you're going to kill yourself. It could be a habit that is destructive, that is hurtful, that we decide that we're going to stop. It could be a relationship. Honestly, sometimes there are toxic relationships that we just need to get out of. There are states of mind that we need to get rid of. There are all kinds of things that we might commit to doing. And some of them are very moral, spiritual. Some of them are very practical and just everyday kind of things. You could make a commitment to being on time to work every day this week. And you're thinking, yeah, the Lord might come back too. Because they're about as likely, right? Especially if you get to drive the highways in and around Massachusetts, they're just a little bit unpredictable for traffic. No matter what we commit to doing, there seems to be something that works against us. And that something, most often, is temptation. Now, temptation, just by way of review, and we said this last week, and it's important to keep these terms defined in our own mind because, if it's one of those things where if you're not careful to define it, you might miss out. It's like love. What is that show? I just saw a commercial. Daddy, what is love? And it's, the father starts hemming and hawing because it's one of those things that we all know what it means, but don't ask me to define it. Temptation can sometimes fall into that category. I know what it is, but how to define it. And when we do define it, we tend to define it almost too narrowly. We think of temptation, especially, as in church, we tend to think of temptation as being something that is defined and kind of confined to the area of morality. And really, temptation is broader than that. And so the working definition that we have for temptation is that it is the urge to do anything other than what you've committed to doing. That's temptation. The urge to do anything other than what you've committed to doing. It brings in the moral sense. You decide you're going to stop some sinful habit. You have the urge to do something other than that, which is doing that sinful habit. So that falls in. It may just be a matter of, losing weight, getting to work on time, you're going to have the urge to hit your snooze bar. You're going to have the urge to do something that distracts you and makes you run late and then drive like a crazy person. And so temptation is a broader concept, and so that's why we work with that, the urge to do something other than what you have committed to doing. Now, here's the problem with temptation, and this really is the problem with it for us, is temptation isn't temptation until you want to do it. Does that make sense? Temptation is not temptation until you want to do it. There are a lot of bad habits that people have that you may not be tempted by. But there are some things that you are tempted by. Those things that aren't yours are not, for instance, one of the things that I have never faced as a genuine temptation is the temptation to do any kind of drugs. You could walk in here with a wheelbarrow full of cocaine, and I am zero tempted. I'm just not interested. Now, there could be somebody in this room, and I don't mean to belittle it, there could be somebody in this room for whom that is a genuine temptation. And it's not a temptation until you actually want to do it. Now, if you take that same wheelbarrow and you fill it full of Krispy Kremes, I'm in trouble. Because I do happen to love donuts. And so, you think about temptation. That's what makes it hard. Because there are the things that tempt us are the things that we want to do anyway. They're just not the things that we've committed to doing. And that's why temptation is so very difficult. And what happens is, as we face temptation, and it seems like, we get in the trenches of whatever we've committed to doing, and the temptation just keeps coming at us. And the desire to do what we've already committed to not doing rolls at us, is that you can almost get a sense of panic. Because you almost begin to feel like things are out of control, like you don't have a choice in the matter, or the temptation's just never going to go away. And in those moments, here's what we do. We rationalize it this way. I'll just give in to this temptation so that the pressure of the temptation will be relieved, and then I can go back to the commitment I've made. You ever been there? Now, sitting here in this safe environment that we're in this morning, you go, well, that's pretty dumb. And it is. But in the moment of temptation, I think many of us have been there, that we think, maybe I'll just cave a little bit and get rid of the pressure, and then I'll go back to the commitment. And we get almost into this panicky kind of mindset, like we just can't not do it, that the only response that's left to us is to just cave into it, and we're just never going to make it. And the commitments that we make are always going to fall by the wayside because we just can't get past this whole temptation thing. And ultimately, we feel like we don't have a choice. Like the temptation's just going to come, and I'm not going to be able to resist it, so why try? And we feel really almost powerless, and like we don't have a choice or say in the matter. The truth of the matter is we don't need to panic. And we're here in the book of James. Now, James, if you'll think about the author of this particular book, James, do you know who he was? This guy, James, was Jesus' little brother. Okay? So, now, had James seen perfection in action? Yeah. Parents, you ever made the mistake, and it is a mistake, to say to your kids, why don't you be more like your older sibling? It is something that we do. I know that we don't love our children differently. We don't compare our children. They are all individuals. But every once in a while, in moments of weakness, you're like, why can't you be more like fill in the blank? Could you imagine growing up in Jesus' house? Why can't you be more like Jesus? He always does what's right. And you think of James as someone going, Mom, he's God. Of course he's doing it right. I can't be more like Jesus. You get Jude. I mean, you read through the book of Jude, which is, toward the almost near Revelation. Jude is Jesus' little brother too. And Jude has got a bit of a temper. And it comes out in his book that he's a little bit short. And you can imagine how that was growing up. Jude, why can't you be more like Jesus? He's just always calm and peaceful and respectful and polite. And Jude is like, Mom, I can't be. So imagine, here's James. Now, James is writing this book, and James has seen perfection in action. James has seen somebody, front row seat for somebody who never, ever caved into temptation. And Jesus was tempted. We know that. But he never gave into temptation. And Jesus saw this sinless life in action. And having seen it, he can actually kind of demystify for us a little bit of this temptation thing, how it works, how it should or could work for us as individuals. And so, beginning in verse 12, we're going to kind of jump in the middle of his book here, or the beginning of it. In verse 12, he begins to demystify temptation for us in order to help us get past it. And he begins actually with a promise of temptation, the promise of the ability to resist temptation. And we find this in verse 12. And what's interesting to me as we read this verse is that if God is prescribing a blessing, and if God is making a promise that we can overcome temptation, guess what that means? Right off the bat, it means that we can. God's not going to pronounce a blessing on something that we aren't able to do. And so just the fact that he begins with this promise is a good thing. He says in verse 12, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." Now, have you ever been in the throes of temptation and thought, wow, this is such a blessing? Anybody ever been there? You know, you're sweating bullets trying not to do the thing that you've committed not to do, or trying to do the thing that you have committed to doing, and you want to quit, and everything within you is screaming to get out of this situation. You ever thought, wow, this is such a blessing to be here? If you have, you are not normal. What is normal for most of us is we begin to have a bit of a plum syndrome. You know, poor little old me, plum. And we begin to really regret and really dislike and almost hate the situation we're in. And yet that situation, James here describes as a blessing. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. When you're enduring it, not when you're caving into it. When you are in that moment where everything within you wants to get out, and you begin to panic, and you begin to sweat, and you begin to really feel it, James says, here's the blessing. When you endure temptation, you actually garner God's approval. That's not too bad. As a child, we want to please and appease our Father. You know, we want to get their approval. We want to win their approval. Even as an adult, looking at my Heavenly Father, I want Him to be happy with my life. I want to win His approval, not because I am His son and He's obligated, but because I have done well and He is proud. And James says part of the blessing is we win God's approval because we're doing something of which God Himself is proud of us for enduring. But beyond God's approval, we also get God's award. He said He rewards it. Now, this crown of life that he's talking about here is the Stephanos crown. It is that laurel crown that is given to the winner in an Olympian competition. You think about the ancient games and even the modern games. You go through all of the struggle to get to the games, and then you go through all of the struggle at the game, whatever your event may be. And you're pitting your skills against the best of the best, and that means you have to perform at your absolute heroic best. The person who actually finally endures and wins that, and there's only one. In the ancient world, in Roman times, they would actually be awarded at the hands of the king, at the hands of the emperor. They would receive this laurel crown to indicate you are the winner. I mean, it's only the modern Olympics that you get gold, silver, and bronze. It used to just be crown, no crown. You had one winner, and that was it. Now we have at least, three placers, or two placers and a winner. But the same idea, that you would actually be awarded this crown for those who endure temptation. Now, here's the thing about any Olympic sport. I think even, what's that sport where you just throw the brick and then you sweep the ice? Curling? Which is ridiculous because there's no curling going on there. I think curling is like this. I have no idea. Anyway, but even there is effort, and that game may be pushing it. I'm not sure how much effort it is to sweep ice. Like dirt really doesn't stick to ice. Anyway, But any Olympic sport, whether it's, wrestling. I swam in high school. I know that's kind of hard to believe, but I actually did. And I know that swimming and trying to swim fast and trying to swim distance, I mean, there is exertion in that process. You think about, people who are, martial artists or fencing or whatever the event may be, it is seriously strenuous just to compete. Add to that, then winning. And then equate that to our life. Enduring temptation may actually be a strenuous, legitimate struggle to win. And so God, as our Heavenly Father, beyond being just proud of us, rewards and awards us when we endure temptation. Let that promise serve as a bit of motivation for you in the next time, like 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now, an hour from now, tomorrow, when you face temptation and you don't want to cave. Let that serve as motivation, and it should be. And then James goes on to moving from this promise of a blessing to the source of temptation. He kind of just opens it up and lets us see and know how temptation works. And this is where it becomes very practical, very important for us. Because if I know the process, then it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier to say, I understand the process and here's how I can get out. And this, for a lot of people, is completely mysterious. And James says, look, we don't want it to be mysterious. And so he gives us the source of temptation. And he begins in verse 13, and he says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Now, this is kind of a strange, just aside almost, this particular verse. What happens when you cave to temptation? Are you quick to blame yourself, or are you looking for somebody else to blame? You ever notice that about, just humanity in general? The whole blame game thing, I think that's been going on right since about the garden, right since the first sin, that we looked for somebody else to blame. It's not my fault. This is just the way I am. It's not my fault I had this temptation. It's not my fault this happened. It's not my fault that happened. And one of the things that we have historically done as a people is we blame God. When anything goes bad, we blame God. If anything goes well, we take the credit. Have you ever seen that dynamic at play? It's like, things are terrible. It's God's fault. Backwards, it's probably ours. And things are great. Hey, look how good I'm doing. And that's probably backwards. That's probably God. And so we reverse that. And James says, look, for starters, don't play the blame game. Because there is nobody else to blame. Certainly, you cannot blame God. God cannot be tempted by evil, and God does not tempt with evil. You cannot blame God. And so just as a starter, don't blame. And then he goes on to the real source of temptation. God isn't the source. Verse 14, and we're going to camp in these last two verses for a couple minutes. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And there's everything that we really need to know about temptation, its source, and its process. Temptation begins with being lured away. Now, I'm not much into fishing. I am just moderately more successful at fishing than I am at farming. And so you've all heard about my exploits in farming, that I really can't grow anything. The truth be told, the only thing I've ever really caught, especially in freshwater fish-wise, has been like sunfish. Now, I don't eat fish, and so it's not a tragedy to me to put them back. If I got a bass or a trout, I wouldn't know what to do with it anyway, because it's not like I could take it home to cook it. I'd probably call you and say, hey, I got a fish. You clean it, you keep it. That's just kind of how it would roll in our world. Now, I grew up fishing as a teenager in the Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay, so I have actually caught some saltwater fish. I know there's saltwater fish, and I even caught a shark once, and that was all kinds of fun. But I don't have a lot of success fishing left to my own devices. I know they're in the water somewhere, but you get guys who know exactly where they are, and they know exactly what they eat, and they have all these lures, and they get out there and they put the lure in the water and they catch fish. I put things in the water, and I must just be picking the places where the fish aren't. Or I'm just picking the wrong lure because I have no idea what fish eat. I just assume they should, eat normal food. I don't know. Flakes don't really stay on the hook very well. But for us, and it works the same way, there are things that we do respond to. And temptation begins with that. It begins with being lured by something. And this is why it's important to remember it's not temptation until you want to do it. There are things you're not going to be tempted by, and there are things you're always going to be tempted by. Temptation begins when we are lured. We're being lured away from our commitment, whatever it might be, whether it's in the moral realm, something sinful, something not sinful, just in the practical realm, something that I've committed to doing. The first thing that we're going to face is being lured away from that. We are lured, James says, by our own desires. So what ultimately is the source of my temptation? I am. That's not good news always, because I can't really get away from myself that well. No matter how fast I run, I always keep up with me. So temptation starts, this allure, this luring away comes from my own desires. My own desires bait me into wanting something, and my own desires beguile me into moving toward it. See the problem? And so there's the first thing. And then what applies for me applies to you. We are led away by things that allure us. Secondly, temptation then takes hold. And James uses this picture of conception, that the temptation actually finally is able to germinate, takes hold, and starts to move into something else. Temptation takes hold before we act on it. There will always come a moment in our temptation where we make a decision to act on what we want. It's not like, we would like to say we were surprised. That, I was surprised by my own behavior. No, you weren't. Because you reached a point in this process where you chose. No matter what it is, something big, something little, you were tempted, and that temptation finally took hold, and you actually made a decision to act on it. Now, the decision and the act may be very close together, but they are distinguishable. They are separate events. And so James says that sin takes hold, it conceives before we act on it. If we can keep ourselves from making that decision, we can short-circuit this process. It just doesn't move any further than that because it is our choice. It is our choice to act on it. And then he says that temptation takes hold and it gives birth or produces sin. Now, again, we talked about this a little bit last week, but we need to keep our definitions in mind. Sin, it's an archery term, and it means simply to miss the target. Whatever target we're aiming at, however wide we miss it by, sin just means to miss the target. And so when temptation takes root, when temptation bears fruit, we miss the target. Morally, it's missing the target that God has set for us and the things that he has called us as individuals to do or to not do. And this is that kind of traditional definition of sin that doesn't surprise anybody in church. But practically, it's also missing the target that we've set for ourselves. You say, going back to being on time for work every day this week, 5 days in a row. That for some of us, that would be a stretch. But temptation and giving into temptation means, say on Tuesday, I'm supposed to be there at 9, I'm going to be there at 9:15. Now, we wouldn't necessarily think of that as sin per se, but sin in missing the target, that's what we just did. We missed the target. If you have a goal in life to accomplish some task, you want to read a dozen books this year because there's 12 months and I can read a book a month, and so I'm going to do that. It's April and I'm running a book behind. You are off target, which means you have sinned, not in the moral sense, but in the sense of missing that target. And this is what happens when we give in to temptation. It bears fruit, it gives birth, and we begin to miss our targets. Sin that's committed that is born in us then begins to grow up. And James talk about sin when it has fully grown or fully matured. What happens is we face a temptation, we give into it. Is that ever the end of the story? Don't you wish it was? Like just once and done, right? What happens is, though, we give into a temptation and it becomes that much harder to resist it next time. So I gave into the temptation today because I wanted to relieve the pressure. Well, tomorrow I'm going to face the same temptation, but because I gave into it today, it's going to be that much harder to resist it tomorrow. And when it rolls around into Tuesday and it rolls around into Wednesday, every time I face that temptation, it becomes easier to give in and harder to resist. And that sin that initially was kind of in an infantile, I just did it once, is growing into this bigger and bigger thing. It's becoming more and more mature as it happens more and more often in my life. And what ends up happening is I create an appetite, or I create a habit, or I create even an addiction in my own life because I continually did not resist a temptation. That's where appetites come from. That's where habits come from. That's where addictions come from. It's not the other way around. You're not addicted to something before you do it. It's once you start doing it that you can get addicted, and that's just the way that it works. And so sin begins to mature, it begins to grow, it gets bigger. And then James says, sin that is completed, sin that is mature, sin that is fully grown, brings forth death. Now, how many of you died when you sinned? Nobody? You're like, Pastor, I didn't die. I'm right here. Just not a funeral, it's church. Right. And so here's the thing that we misunderstand. It's one of those definition things again. What is death? This was all the way back to the Garden of Eden. What did the serpent say to Adam and Eve? You won't really die. God knows that you're not going to die. You're not going to eat that fruit and drop over dead. It doesn't work that way. And so he calls God a liar because he twists the definition of death. What is death? Okay, so the obvious. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. Death is separation of my soul from my body. That's what happens when we die. My soul leaves, my body stays. Gives us a clue that death is separation. That's physical death. My soul leaves my body. Spiritual death is I become separated from God. You think about suffering in hell through all of eternity, the separation you face is a separation from God. And so you have physical death, separation of the soul from the body, spiritual death, separation of the person from God, and then practical death, because you can actually die practically and still be alive. Practical death is the separation of my reality from my potential. Separation of my reality from my potential. You think about everybody that you could see in your life who their life is miserable, who they're a slave to their habits. I think of, and I don't want or mean to belittle, but you think of people who live on the streets who are just absolutely consumed by their addictions and their appetites, and who squander every resource put in their way to further their addictions and their habits. It's a tragedy because everybody has value, and we're all made to be image bearers of God, and that is not a very good image bearer of God. And there's no way to say it other than that it's an unspeakable tragedy. But nobody started off that way. Every person that's born has tremendous potential as an individual. Every kid in school has amazing potential that they could reach. Every adult in every dead-end job in the world still has an amazing amount of potential to be an image bearer of God, to accomplish things by God, for God, through God, with God. We all have an amazing amount of potential. And oftentimes in life, we get separated from that potential. Our reality doesn't live up to that potential. We squander it, we waste it. We have appetites, we have habits, we have things that we allow to get into our life that make our reality go left when our potential went right. And so you have physical death, separation of the soul from the body. You have spiritual death, the separation of the person from God. But you have practical death as well, the separation of my reality from my potential. And most often in day-to-day life, that's the death that we're going to experience. Is that any less real than regular death? We think about death. Is that a lie to say that my separation from my potential, from my reality, could we call that death, I think, realistically? I mean, it fits the definition, but does it fit our experience? I think it does. And especially when you take it amplified out to its most tragic ends, it definitely does. And so sin, James says, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Turns out when God said to Adam and Eve that in the day that they ate of the fruit, they were going to die, it wasn't they were going to start dying, but their potential in that day was squandered, and their reality became something vastly different from what God intended. Their reality became vastly separated from their potential, and so they did in fact die, just as God said they would and knew that they would. And so in our own lives, we think about this, just kind of summarize it. We're lured by our desires. This is temptation. If we decide that we're going to move in, and it is a choice, then sin becomes born in our life, and as it gets bigger, as it grows up, we become more separated, more dead from where we should be. And it's not necessarily encouraging, except for one small fact in this entire process is I have choice. I have choice. Really, at every stage of this process, I have choice. The bad news, I really am my own worst enemy. The good news is I could also be my own best friend. Think about it. Think about the process. You can actually change what lures you. Did you know that? You can actually change what is of interest to you, what excites you, what tempts you. You can actually change that. You think, I can't change my appetites. How do you change your appetite? It is possible. Some of you know, I haven't always drank coffee. The reason I drink so much coffee now is I'm making up for a couple decades of lost time. That's what I tell myself anyway. It sounds like I'm probably kidding myself. But I honestly didn't. I didn't start drinking coffee until I was about halfway through squeezing 5 years of college into 4 years of college into 5. About my second, I think it was my third year of college, I actually started drinking coffee. Prior to that, I just couldn't take the taste of it at all. And like a lot of people who start drinking coffee, I started drinking coffee with sugar and cream in it. And so no cream, no sugar, no coffee. And wasn't interested. It was the only way I could do it. And I drank coffee for a long time with cream and sugar. That's just how you drink coffee. In fact, if you go up to Dunkin' Donuts this morning and you said, I want a regular coffee, guess how they're going to give it to you? With cream and sugar, because that's the regular way that regular people drink it. You go to the South and you order regular coffee, and you know what they're going to give you? Coffee that's caffeinated as opposed to decaffeinated, because they don't know what regular means down there. What's funny is you leave New England and you go to Dunkin' Donuts, you're like, yeah, I'll have a large regular. And they're like, you're from New England, aren't you? Yeah, why? Because you want cream and sugar in that, don't you? Yes, that's what regular coffee is. They don't know that. And so, I drank coffee regular for a number of years. And then one time I got this bright idea. One, the cream bothers my stomach a little bit. And two, given the amount of coffee that I drink, I decided I probably didn't need that much sugar in combination with that much caffeine. And so I decided, you know what? I need to quit the cream and I need to quit the sugar. And so I made this decision one day, and I just stopped putting cream and sugar in my coffee. Man, I hated coffee. But of course, I hated headaches, and so I kept drinking the coffee. And this went on for a while. Guess how I drink my coffee today? I drink my coffee black, except at Dunkin' Donuts, because that's not regular. But by and large, I drink my coffee black, and if you've ever made coffee for me, as several of you have, how do you take your coffee? The way it comes out of the pot. Perfect. Drink my coffee black. Guess how I prefer my coffee? I prefer my coffee black. I like to be able to taste the coffee. And you can taste all kinds of nuances and subtleties in the coffee, and you can taste all the differences in all the different kinds of coffee because you're not throwing a whole bunch of stuff at it. I prefer it black. I reprogrammed my desire. Now, I didn't get rid of coffee, but I reprogrammed how I drink it. And that's a pretty big accomplishment. If you've ever had to switch from light cream to skim milk because of the whole cholesterol thing, or you're going to, switch from sugar to blue stuff or pink stuff because of the, So we can actually change what lures us. We can change the things that actually we desire. It does take work, but it is possible. And so there's our first thing. We can change what lures us. Secondly, we can choose to not let temptation take hold. When we are facing temptation, we hit that moment where we decide yes or no. We can actually decide no. Now, does that mean the pressure is going to continue going? It may, but at no point are you out of control where you say, I no longer have a choice. You always have a choice. And so we can choose to not let temptation take hold. And lastly, you can change your mind. Even once you make the decision, I'm going to cave into this temptation, until you actually do it, you have the opportunity to change your mind. You can say, yes, I'm going to do it. And before you do it, you say, no, that's stupid. Why would I do that? Change your mind. You actually can do that. And so the good news of this passage, and I think it's really the takeaway, it's kind of the powerful thought for me, is the choice is up to you. When it comes to temptation, the choice is up to you. Plays well with last week's application. You do not have to sin. The choice is up to you. You are either your own worst enemy or your own best friend. What you decide to be is up to you. So you don't need to panic. You just need to choose better. Make sense? So don't let it be mystified to you. Don't let yourself be a slave to it. Don't let yourself feel like you don't have a choice. No matter how much pressure you face, how much desire you have, how intense the urge is to not follow through on what you committed to doing, morally, practically. The choice really is up to you, and you can make it happen, or you cannot. That's the great thing about choice. Father, we love you. We thank you for the day. I thank you for James, who saw Jesus and saw perfection in action, and who saw Jesus time and again in his own life make the choice to resist the temptation. Lord, we think about what we know of the Gospels in Jesus' experience, and we saw him resist and make the choice to not give in to the things that tempted him. And we're thankful for that. We're thankful for the pattern. We're thankful for the example. We're thankful for the salvation, because he wouldn't have been able to do that if he'd sinned. But Father, for each of us, we get panicky at times because we feel like we can't get out of the temptation. Would you help us to see that we legitimately, genuinely have a choice? Help us to make the choice to do what's right. Help us to make the choice in that moment to follow through on what we've committed. Thank you for it in Jesus' good name.